Look, I know what you're thinking. Another Bigfoot story, right? But stick with me here, because what happened to Mark Henderson in the Montana wilderness isn't just another campfire tale. This is about a discovery that changed everything. And I mean everything about a 200 square mile stretch of forest that nobody goes near anymore. They call it the silent territory now. And before you click away, let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a forest that's gone completely quiet? I'm not talking about peaceful quiet. I'm talking about the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. The kind where even the insects stop making noise. Where every animal has just vanished. That's what we're dealing with here. So grab a coffee, get comfortable, and whatever you do, don't watch this alone at night. Because by the end of this video, you're going to understand why entire towns have been evacuated from one of the most beautiful places in America. Let's dive in. Mark's hands trembled as he pulled a massive Bigfoot skull from the earth, nearly twice the size of a human head, with bones so ancient it crumbled at his touch. In 20 years of hiking Montana's remote wilderness, he'd never seen anything like it. But what he didn't know was that removing it would awaken something that had been sleeping for centuries. He'd discovered it half buried near a creek bed, 15 miles from the nearest trail. The bone was calcified, ancient, with eye sockets that seemed to stare back at him with an unsettling intelligence. Every instinct told him to leave it alone. But Mark was a collector. As he carefully extracted the skull from its resting place, the forest around him fell completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. The skull felt heavier than it should have as Mark carried it down the mountain. Not physically, the weight was manageable. But carrying it felt wrong, like he was transporting something that didn't want to be moved. By the time he reached his cabin, he'd made a decision. He would study it alone first, document everything, understand what he had before the scientific community descended with their skepticism and protocols. Some discoveries demanded privacy before scrutiny. Under the harsh glow of LED lights, Mark spread the skull across his examination table. Mark's hands trembled as he recorded the cranial capacity measurement, nearly 2,000 cubic centimeters. He set down his calipers and stepped back from the table, suddenly aware of what those numbers implied about the creature that had once worn this bone. For comparison, modern humans averaged 1,400 cubic centimeters. The bone thickness was extraordinary, almost an inch in some places. The jaw structure was the most disturbing feature. Massive molars designed for crushing, with canine teeth that suggested an omnivorous diet. The temporal muscles would have been incredibly powerful, judging by the pronounced attachment points on the skull. This creature could have generated a bite force that would crush bone. Mark stepped back from the table, suddenly aware of how quiet his cabin had become. The skull commanded his attention in ways that defied rational explanation. Its empty sockets didn't just reflect the harsh LED light, they seemed to absorb it, creating depths that pulled at his vision whenever he tried to look away. The bone felt warm under the lights, almost alive, and Mark found himself returning to the examination table compulsively, drawn by an inexplicable need to study it just one more time. Mark had studied primatology in college before switching to engineering. He knew gorilla skulls, orangutan skulls, even fossil hominids like Australopithecus. This matched none of them. The cranial features were distinctly human-like in some ways, but the size and robusticity suggested something far more primitive and powerful. The measurements defied explanation, but Mark found himself taking them again and again, as if the skull might reveal new secrets with each examination. The closest match was Gigantopithecus, the extinct giant ape from Asia, but even those fossils were smaller than what sat before him. This skull suggested a creature that stood at least 9 feet tall, possibly more. The bone showed signs of great age. Carbon dating would be expensive, but the mineralization patterns suggested centuries, possibly millennia. The surface was weathered but intact, with no signs of damage from scavengers or the elements. It had been protected, buried in that specific location for a very long time. Mark's documentation became obsessive. He researched similar discoveries online, finding the famous minaret skull from 1965 that had disappeared from UCLA's collection after initial analysis deemed it some anthropoid species other than human. Other alleged Bigfoot skull discoveries had been dismissed as hoaxes or misidentified bear skulls. But this was different. The bone density, the cranial features, the sheer size, everything pointed to an unknown primate species. Hours turned into days as he measured, photographed, and cross-referenced every detail, preparing for the scientific scrutiny that would follow his announcement. That's when he noticed the silence outside had persisted. He'd been so absorbed in his work that he hadn't left the cabin in 3 days. At first, he'd attributed the quiet to his own focus. The cabin's thick walls and his concentration on the skull had simply masked the normal forest sounds. But by the 3rd day, even with the windows open, the silence was undeniable. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was listening. His cabin sat on 40 acres of dense woodland, normally alive with the calls of ravens, the chatter of squirrels, the distant howls of coyotes. The silence was absolute and unnatural. Mark stepped onto his porch, listening intently. The wind still moved through the trees, creating the soft whisper of pine needles. But no animal sounds penetrated the quiet. It was as if every living creature had simply vanished from the area. He called his neighbor, Tom, who lived 3 miles down the mountain road. Tom confirmed the same eerie quiet around his property. "It's like someone turned off the sound in the forest," Tom said. "My dogs won't even go outside. They just whine and hide under the porch." Scientific explanations for forest silence typically involved predators, hawks, mountain lions, or bears that caused prey animals to freeze and hide. But this silence was too widespread, too persistent. Predators moved through territories. They didn't establish permanent dead zones. Mark researched ecological causes for such phenomena. Disease outbreaks could devastate local wildlife populations, but that would leave evidence dead animals, signs of sickness. Toxic contamination might drive animals away, but the forest showed no signs of environmental damage. The trees remained healthy. The streams ran clear. The more he studied the skull, the more convinced he became that its removal had triggered something. Indigenous cultures often spoke of sacred burial grounds, places where disturbing the remains of powerful beings brought consequences. Mark had always dismissed such beliefs as superstition, but the silence was spreading. Tom reported that his neighbor, another 2 miles down the mountain, had noticed the quiet reaching his property. Whatever was happening, it was expanding outward from Mark's location like ripples in a pond. The skull no longer just sat on his examination table, it demanded his presence. Even when Mark tried to sleep, he could feel its pull from the next room, an insistent weight that drew him back to study its ancient features. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he'd crossed a line he didn't even know existed. By the fifth day, the silence had become a living thing. Mark stood on his porch at dawn, coffee mug in hand, straining to hear even the faintest chirp or rustle. The absence of sound was so complete, it felt oppressive, pressing against his eardrums like deep water. Tom called again that morning, his voice tight with worry. "It's reached the Johnson place now. That's 6 miles from you, Mark. Sarah says her chickens won't leave their coop. They're all huddled together like they're terrified of something." Mark drove down the mountain road to see for himself. The Johnsons' property sat in a natural meadow where deer typically grazed in the early morning hours. The meadow was empty. No deer tracks in the soft earth near their pond. No birds working the berry bushes along the fence line. Sarah Johnson met him at her gate, her face pale. "It started 3 days ago," she said. "First the wild birds stopped coming to my feeders. Then the deer disappeared. Yesterday, even the insects went quiet. No cricket songs at night. It's like the whole forest just died." But the forest wasn't dead. The trees remained healthy, their needles green and full. Streams flowed clear and cold. Wildflowers bloomed in the meadows. By every measurable standard, the ecosystem was thriving, except for the complete absence of wildlife. Mark contacted the state wildlife department, expecting them to dismiss his concerns. Instead, the biologist he spoke with, Dr. Elena Vasquez, expressed immediate interest. "We've had 3 similar reports in the past week," she said. "All in your general area. It's unprecedented." Dr. Vasquez arrived 2 days later with monitoring equipment. She set up acoustic sensors at various points around Mark's property, devices designed to detect even the faintest animal sounds. As the data came in, Mark watched her face change. She pulled up the acoustic readout and pointed at the screen a flat, featureless line across a 40-square-mile radius. "This shouldn't be possible," she whispered. "In 30 years of wildlife research, I've never seen anything like this. Even after major forest fires or disease outbreaks, you get some animal activity. Scavengers, at minimum. This is a complete biological silence." She took soil samples, water samples, and air quality readings. Everything tested normal. No toxins, no unusual chemical signatures, no signs of disease or contamination. The forest was healthy by every measurable standard, except for the complete absence of wildlife. The silence was expanding at a predictable rate, roughly 1 mile per day in all directions. Local residents began calling it the dead zone, though nothing was actually dead. Animals simply refused to enter the area, and those that had been present when it began had fled. Mark's neighbor Tom reported seeing a massive black bear family mother and 2 cubs running down the mountain road in broad daylight, something he'd never witnessed in 40 years of living there. "They weren't just moving," Tom said. "They were fleeing, running like something was chasing them." But nothing was chasing them. The forest stood empty and silent, beautiful and terrifying in its unnatural quiet. Mark began having trouble sleeping. The absolute silence at night felt wrong on a fundamental level. Human beings evolved in environments filled with natural sounds. The complete absence of audio cues triggered a primal unease, a sense that predators could approach undetected. He found himself checking the skull obsessively, measuring it again and again, photographing it from every angle. The bone seemed unchanged, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow aware of his attention. The empty eye sockets followed him around the room. Dr. Vasquez expanded her monitoring zone, bringing in additional researchers and equipment. The phenomenon was attracting attention from universities and government agencies. But as the scientific community mobilized to study the silence, Mark was beginning to understand a disturbing truth. The removal of the skull hadn't just created an ecological anomaly. It had awakened something that wanted its territory back. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Joseph Crow Feather, an elder from the nearby Blackfeet Nation, appeared at Mark's cabin on a Tuesday morning without warning or invitation. He was a weathered man in his 70s, with silver braids and eyes that seemed to hold decades of forest wisdom. "You took something that wasn't meant to be taken," Joseph said without preamble, studying Mark's face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Mark invited him inside, unsure how the elder had even learned about the skull. He hadn't publicized his discovery beyond the scientific community and a few neighbors. But Joseph walked directly to the examination table where the skull sat under its protective cloth. "This is why the forest weeps," Joseph said, pulling back the cloth. He didn't seem surprised by what he saw. "My grandfather told stories of such bones, markers left by the old ones to warn the living where they should not tread." Joseph explained that his people had oral traditions dating back centuries about giant beings that once walked these mountains. Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he realized what Joseph was implying. "You're saying the skull," he began, "is a boundary marker," Joseph finished. "A warning left by the old ones to tell future generations. This territory belongs to the spirit world. When you removed it, you removed the barrier that kept them in their rest." "The bones mark the edges of their hunting grounds," Joseph said. "Remove them, and you remove the barriers that keep the old ones in their rest. The silence you hear is the forest holding its breath, waiting to see what awakens." Mark found himself caught between scientific skepticism and mounting evidence that something beyond normal understanding was occurring. He'd always respected indigenous knowledge systems, but this challenged his worldview in fundamental ways. "With respect, Mr. Crowfeather, I'm a rational person. I believe in evidence and scientific method. What you're describing sounds like folklore." Joseph's expression didn't change. "Your evidence is the silence. Your scientific method has no explanation for what's happening. Sometimes the old knowledge is the only knowledge that matters." The elder shared historical accounts that had never been written down, stories passed from grandfather to grandson for generations. Other skull discoveries in the past century, he claimed, had triggered similar consequences. A mining operation in 1923 had uncovered bones near Glacier National Park. Within days, wildlife fled the area, and 3 miners disappeared. The operation was abandoned after workers reported being stalked by something massive that left no tracks. In 1967, a collector like Mark had found similar remains near the Canadian border. The man had refused to return the bones despite warnings from local tribes. His cabin was found destroyed 6 months later, with no trace of the collector or the skull he'd taken. "The old ones don't rest easy when their markers are disturbed," Joseph said. "They wake to reclaim what was always theirs. The forest goes silent because even the smallest creatures can sense their presence." Mark wanted to dismiss these stories as coincidence and folklore, but Dr. Vasquez's monitoring equipment was providing data that supported the elder's warnings. The dead zone continued expanding at exactly 1 mile per day, with no scientific explanation for the phenomenon. Joseph offered a solution. "Return the bones to where you found them. Perform the proper ceremonies to ask forgiveness. The old one might return to its rest. But Mark hesitated. This skull represented a discovery that could rewrite human understanding of North American prehistory. It was potential proof of an unknown primate species, evidence that could validate decades of Bigfoot research. Returning it felt like destroying invaluable scientific data. "I need more time to study it," Mark said, "to document everything properly before making any decisions about its disposition." Joseph's face hardened. "Time is not something you have. Each day the skull remains away from its resting place. The old one grows stronger. Soon, returning it won't be enough. It will want something more." The elder left without another word, but his warning echoed in Mark's mind as the silence pressed closer around his cabin. That night, he dreamed of massive footsteps circling his property and woke to find the morning more quiet than ever. The skull sat on his table, ancient and patient, waiting. The first footprint appeared on the 10th day. Mark discovered it during his morning inspection of the property perimeter, a ritual he'd developed since the silence began. At first, he thought it was a bear track. The soil was disturbed near his woodshed, the impression deep in the soft earth where recent rain had left the ground perfectly receptive to tracks. But as he knelt to examine it more closely, his breath caught. The shape was wrong. The proportions were wrong. Everything about it was wrong. The footprint measured 18 inches long and 7 inches wide at its broadest point, nearly twice the size of any bear print he'd ever seen. The impression was nearly 2 inches deep, suggesting something that weighed well over 400 pounds. 5 distinct toe marks were visible, with what appeared to be claw or nail impressions at the tips. The stride pattern showed a bipedal gait, but the distance between prints was nearly 5 feet. Mark photographed the track from every angle, using his hiking boot for scale. He'd seen bear tracks, elk tracks, even the occasional mountain lion print on his property. This matched none of them. The foot structure was distinctly humanoid, but impossibly large, with proportions that suggested a creature of enormous size and weight. He called Dr. Vasquez immediately. She arrived within hours, bringing casting materials and additional monitoring equipment. As they worked to preserve the track, she discovered something that made both of them deeply uneasy. "Mark, look at this," she said, pointing to the ground around the print. "There's no approach or departure trail. This single print just appears, like whatever made it materialized at this spot and vanished." They searched the entire area methodically. The creature should have left a clear trail of prints leading to and from the woodshed. Instead, they found only the single perfect impression, isolated and inexplicable. That night, Mark's motion-activated security cameras triggered for the first time since the silence began. He reviewed the footage with growing dread. At 2:17 a.m., the camera facing his driveway recorded a massive shadow moving between the trees at the forest edge. The figure was upright, easily 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long arms that swayed as it moved. The creature stayed just at the edge of the camera's infrared range, never fully revealing itself, but clearly observing the cabin. For nearly 20 minutes, it remained motionless at the tree line. Then it simply melted back into the darkness. Mark enhanced the footage, adjusting contrast and brightness, but the figure remained frustratingly indistinct. What he could see matched no known animal. The proportions were wrong for a bear standing upright. The bulk and height exceeded any human possibility. The way it moved suggested intelligence and purpose. More cameras triggered over the following nights. The creature was circling his property, staying just beyond clear visual range, but making its presence unmistakably known. Each night, it came closer to the cabin. Dr. Vasquez installed additional monitoring equipment, including thermal imaging cameras and seismic sensors. The thermal readings confirmed something large and warm-blooded was moving through the forest around Mark's property. The seismic data showed footfalls that registered significant ground vibration, consistent with something weighing between 600 and 800 pounds. "We're dealing with an unknown large mammal," Dr. Vasquez told Mark as they reviewed the data. "Something that's been avoiding human contact until now. Your discovery may have triggered territorial behavior." But Mark was beginning to understand that this wasn't simply an unknown animal. The timing was too precise, the behavior too focused. The creature had appeared exactly when the silence reached its current boundary. It was connected to the skull, to his violation of whatever ancient boundary the bones had marked. On the 14th night, Mark woke to the sound of something massive moving around his cabin. Heavy footsteps circled the building methodically, testing windows and doors. The creature was no longer content to observe from a distance. Mark grabbed a flashlight and his rifle, though he doubted either would be effective against something of this size. Through his bedroom window, he caught a glimpse of a massive form moving past, blocking out the stars. The smell that followed was overwhelming, a mixture of wet fur, decay, and something else, something ancient and wild that made his primitive brain scream warnings. The footsteps stopped directly outside his front door. Mark could hear breathing, slow and deliberate, as whatever stood there seemed to be listening, evaluating, deciding. Then came the sound that would haunt his dreams, a low, rumbling vocalization that was part growl, part moan, part something else entirely. It was a sound of recognition, of claim, of warning. The creature knew he had the skull, and it wanted it back. The attacks on other hikers began 3 days later. Mark learned about the first incident from a frantic call from the county sheriff's office. 2 experienced backpackers had been stalked for 6 hours while trying to exit the dead zone. They'd entered from the North Trail, unaware of the expanding silence, and found themselves trapped in what they described as a living nightmare. "Something followed us the entire way out," one hiker, Janet Mills, told the sheriff. "We never saw it clearly, but we could hear it moving through the trees parallel to the trail, breaking branches, making these horrible sounds. When we tried to set up camp, it threw rocks at our tent from the darkness." The hikers had abandoned their gear and fled on foot, reaching their vehicle just before dawn. Both were experienced wilderness travelers who'd hiked these mountains for decades. Neither had ever experienced anything like the calculated intimidation they'd endured. Mark drove to the sheriff's office to hear their account firsthand. Janet's hiking partner, Robert Chen, showed him photos on his phone, massive footprints in the mud near their abandoned campsite. Broken trees that looked like they'd been snapped by incredible force, and deep claw marks gouged into the bark of ancient pines. "It was intelligent," Robert said, his hands still shaking as he scrolled through the images. "Whatever's out there, it knew exactly how to terrorize us without actually attacking. It wanted us gone, and it made that very clear." The sheriff, a practical man named Bill Morrison, who'd worked these mountains for 20 years, was taking the reports seriously. "We've had 3 more incidents since yesterday," he told Mark, "all in the same general area. all describing something large and aggressive that's driving people out of the forest. Mark felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. These people were being terrorized because of his decision to remove the skull. The creature, whatever it was, had expanded its territorial enforcement beyond his property to include anyone who entered what it considered its domain. Dr. Vasquez's monitoring equipment was recording escalating activity. The seismic sensors detected movement patterns that suggested the creature was patrolling the entire perimeter of the dead zone, a territory that now encompassed nearly 60 square miles. Thermal imaging showed it moving with purpose and intelligence, following established routes like a guard making rounds. Mark attempted to return the skull twice, but each effort was blocked by increasingly aggressive encounters. On his first attempt, he loaded the skull into his truck and drove toward the original discovery site. 2 miles from his cabin, massive rocks began raining down from the forest onto the road. The bombardment was too precise to be coincidental. The creature was actively preventing him from reaching the burial site. His second attempt, on foot with the skull in a backpack, ended when something began paralleling his movement through the trees, staying just out of sight, but making its presence unmistakably known. The psychological pressure was overwhelming. Every snapped twig, every rustling branch felt like a threat. When Mark finally turned back, he could swear he heard something that sounded almost like satisfaction in the creature's vocalizations. The forest was transforming into something alien and hostile. Trees that had stood for centuries showed fresh damage, bark stripped away in long gouges, branches twisted and broken in patterns that suggested immense strength applied with deliberate intent. The creature was marking its territory, establishing dominance through displays of raw power. Local wildlife that had initially fled the area now seemed unable to return, even if they wanted to. Dr. Vasquez documented attempts by deer and elk to cross the boundary of the dead zone. The animals would approach the invisible line where the silence began, then retreat as if encountering an electric fence. Something was actively maintaining the barrier, enforcing the territorial boundary with supernatural efficiency. Mark realized with growing horror that the creature wasn't just reclaiming its territory, it was expanding it. The dead zone continued growing at its relentless pace of 1 mile per day. At this rate, it would reach the nearest town within a month. Roads would be cut off. Entire communities would be isolated. The creature's vocalizations had changed too. They were no longer warnings, they carried a different tone now. Something that sounded almost like hunger or negotiation, as if the creature was calling for something or someone to answer. The skull sat on his examination table, unchanged and patient. Mark understood now that it had never been just an artifact. It was a boundary marker, a warning, a key that had unlocked something ancient and territorial that had no intention of returning to its slumber. The forest belonged to something else now, and it was making that ownership brutally clear to anyone foolish enough to challenge its claim. Mark's final attempt came on the 21st day, when the dead zone had swallowed 2 more valleys and was approaching the outskirts of Cedar Falls. Desperate and consumed by guilt over the hikers who'd been terrorized, he loaded the skull into his backpack and set out before dawn, determined to reach the original burial site regardless of the consequences. He made it less than a mile before the forest erupted around him. Trees began falling across the trail behind him, cutting off his retreat. The creature emerged from the shadows ahead, no longer content to remain hidden. Mark found himself face to face with something that defied every assumption about what was possible in the natural world. The being stood nearly 10 feet tall, covered in dark, matted fur that seemed to absorb light. Its eyes held an intelligence that was ancient and utterly alien, studying Mark with the patience of something that had waited centuries for this moment. The skull's purpose became horrifyingly clear as Mark stared into that face. It wasn't just a territorial marker, it was a gravestone. The creature had been guarding its own burial site, and Mark had stolen its remains. The skull belonged to this being's ancestor, its predecessor, its kin. The violation wasn't just territorial, it was personal. Mark tried to remove the skull from his backpack to offer it back, but massive hands closed around his shoulders with crushing force. He felt the creature's breath hot and ancient against the back of his neck. And then he understood. The creature wasn't interested in the skull anymore. It was interested in him. The violation wasn't just territorial, it was personal. He had stolen the remains of the creature's kin, and now the creature was going to collect payment. The boundary had been crossed, the ancient compact broken. The forest would remain under its dominion now, expanding until it reclaimed all the territory its kind had once protected. Mark's screams echoed through the silent woods as the creature dragged him deeper into the forest. His backpack, containing the skull, was left abandoned on the trail, where searchers would find it 3 days later, empty. The skull was never recovered. The forest remained forever changed, a dead zone that continues expanding to this day, serving as a warning that some boundaries should never be crossed. Mark's disappearance marked the end of human presence in what locals now call the Silent Territory. But the skull's location remains unknown, and the dead zone continues expanding. Searchers found his backpack 3 days later on the trail, where he vanished empty, except for a single piece of paper with a message scrawled in Mark's handwriting. It's not just territorial, it's hungry. The Silent Territory has grown to encompass over 200 square miles. Entire communities have been evacuated. Wildlife refuses to enter the zone, and according to reports from hikers who ventured too close, the creature's vocalizations have changed. They're no longer warnings. They sound almost like communication. If you've experienced something similar in the wilderness, unexplained silence, territorial behavior, encounters with something that defies explanation, share your story in the comments. We're tracking patterns across North America, and your account could be crucial. Subscribe to stay updated as we investigate what's really happening in the Silent Territory and what it means for the rest of us.